the distinction between power and authority is thin, in the sense that authority subsumes power, but not all expressions of power take the property of an authority. In the notion of authority is implicit a certain readiness to accept authority on the part of those who are subjected to that authority. The readiness can come in a number of ways, and in fact we are now using the ready in a nuanced sense, in the sense that we put it in a within single inverted commas. Given this fact that domination, power, authority all belong to a broader category of determinants of behavior of those who are subjected, authority takes different forms. But to remind ourselves, the classification we are about to offer is once again for the convenience of understanding. In real history, these forms collapse into each other, and the same political system can actually involve more than one form or transit from time to time depending on the contingency of political situation. I think the examples will clarify the proposition. As expected, coercive authority, that is the name of a form, coercive authority, is actually the most prominent kind of authority. So much so, one begins to believe that authority and coercion cannot be disengaged as notions. Falling back on our understanding of role of force or physical force, this particular kind of authority relies entirely on physical force. To whatever we have done by way of elaborating the institutions of power, physical power, we now like to add one more notion, which is the notion of surveillance. That is, those who monopolize control over power and authority, particularly authority, they, in order to direct their power and authority to their chosen subjects, must have a mechanism for continuous scrutiny of behavior on the part of the subjected people. These subjected people can be like the subjects in a feudal system without a right to react back, but they can also be citizens in liberal democratic state enjoying a series of rights. And because it is liberal democracy, the chances of disagreement, dissent, protest become normal. But then dissent, protest, struggles sometimes actually climax into more bitter forms of struggle, could be violent struggle, and civil war would be a very good example of that. In order to preempt the possibility of violence going out of hand on the part of those at a particular point of time are incumbents in authority position, those who are in authority positions must watch continuously about the way the citizens' minds think. This is the problem of those who are in authority position, who continuously negotiate with civil society, assuming for a moment that civil society is really a space for freedom, as it is normally treated from the days of Hegel. That being so, keeping a watch over how citizens think, what they are about to do, we need or the state needs, or whoever is in authority position, wherever is, they need to be watchful and they devise the mechanisms of surveillance. For example, we have police informers, we have hidden cameras, we have local informers within each organization which actually keep those who are in authority informed about tendencies which are basically non-conformist and conflictual. So, any coercive authority rests not only on the control over a quantum of force it can employ, but also on the availability of the sophisticated technology of surveillance on their part. I mean, to go back to George Orwell's famous dictum, the big brother watches and the big brother watches everywhere. What is remarkable that those who are fighting against the state, for example, let us say among the Talibans, or for that matter any dissident group, could be the opponents in Ireland, or let us say currently in Scotland, those who want to secede from England, they also develop their own internal surveillance, whether somebody is betraying somebody else. And the best example would be the mechanisms of a godfather within mafia, because we assume and we take for granted that power is available beyond the state. Surveillance happens to be one major tool through which coercive authority flourishes, and many regimes have lost out because of poor surveillance. This is the universal. There is no political system, there is no state system, there is even no, let us say, economic arrangement which is actually without any kind of use of physical power and surveillance, at least of threat of surveillance, because threat sometimes suffices for many of us. Along with this particular form, we have what is called legitimate authority. Historically speaking, up till now, there have been four major waves in democracy, and each democracy is an assertion that even if somebody uses monopoly of physical power, it must be grounded in a certain legitimacy. So, we normally defined this kind of authority by the source of legitimacy which everybody would accept as a worthy source of legitimacy. We may recall here that Max Weber devoted a good part of his analysis in tracing the possible roots of legitimacy, and for the modern state, for him the only source must be actually rational laws or the constitution which expresses rational laws. But the point is, constitution or no constitution, legitimacy must be grounded in two things at least. One, those who hold legitimate authority must think and believe that they legitimately hold authority, and those who submit to them must also accept they have an obligation to submit to the authority of those who are treated as legitimate authority, and the entire formation of legitimacy actually originates in the civil society. It is not within the state or within the individual citizen, but actually the civil society must develop a consensus that somebody must rule and legitimately, and somebody must submit and legitimately. This is the heart of what we call legitimate authority and what is normally passed off as liberal democracy. What is important is to note that because legitimacy is a good political ploy, those who are actually undemocratic, anti-democratic, dictatorial, they also create grounds of legitimacy. For example, a political party can claim that it has a legitimacy to rule because that party spearheaded the national liberation struggle. Or in the socialist movement, communist parties would claim that they are the legitimate rulers because they made the working class revolution possible. So, the notion of revolution is always constructed. There is nothing which is inherently legitimate. It is actually construction on the part of those who rule, those who enjoy authority, and on the part of those who actually accept that particular notion of legitimacy. This is actually the point when a particular legitimacy becomes suspect. That is actually the moment when those who have been subjected, they take all political routes to pull down that apparently legitimate authority. In democracies, we have a mechanism called election. If it is not a democracy, then it has to be kind of a popular overthrow, which today we are witnessing here and there. If you look at the current spell of protests in throughout Western Europe, probably Europe is now poised to a particular point when election as a mechanism may not be sufficient, because they have tried out the liberal democratic institutions, and if that would not alter the neoliberal policy, it is not impossible they might take recourse to something else. So, always legitimacy is actually a contingent condition. Nobody can claim that somebody is permanently ruling and in a legitimate manner. These two are the two broad forms of authority, and legitimate authority does not do without with application of force, and coercive authority does not do away with the notions of legitimacy. That means that actually they cohabit the same space of the institution, and they choose a path depending on their own strategic choice. Beyond these two, there are two other minor kinds of authority, but to warn you once again that please do not think that any kind of authority is exclusively in a watertight situation, it does not spill over into another kind of authority. The third kind is called competent authority, which is based on somebody claiming, enjoying authority on the public acceptance that he has certain skills, and the best example is the bureaucracy. But then somebody who is an expert in, let us say, in producing indigenous bombs, they can also acquire a certain kind of competence and thereby enjoy a certain degree of authority. I mean, to go back to the muscle men or to go back to the mafia once again, there is also the competent murderers, there are also the competent negotiators. So, that way the idea of competence or the idea of skill is part of any governance. So, there are some people who enjoy authority on the strength of their competence. And the final form is the authority based on the appeal of a particular person, we normally call charismatic authority, and you all know charismatic authority is historically rare, and if there is a charismatic authority, to go back to Max Weber, it soon becomes routinized. So, these are the four forms of authority, and all forms of authority contain elements of power and domination. That way, the conceptual distance between power and authority is actually very small, feeble, and tenuous. The entire discussion so far has actually been made within the framework of what we normally call the modern nation state. But it is wrong to think that the modern nation state is the only expression of power, because there are pre-modern systems, and the time span of pre-modernity is enormous, and that is heterogeneous in the sense that you cannot locate only one particular kind of pre-modern political system. But for the sake of argument and probably for an ease in illustration, we can fall back on the notion of feudalism, and where you have only hereditary authority, and there probably power would be power, authority would be authority, legitimacy would be legitimacy, only their bases would differ, because a particular system is ripe for law, but a particular system is yet not ripe for modern law. But it does not mean power is not there, authority is not there, or legitimacy is not there. This much is acceptable. This is going back into the past. If you return now once again to the present and to the projected future, what we have been observing, particularly since the close of the First World War, is the formation of supranational organizations, let us say the League of Nations, or after the Second World War the United Nations. So, these are certain beyond the nation state organizations which have come up, and they increasingly play a critical role. These are global in their expanse, but apart from those who are global in expanse, there are regional formations like say NATO or SAARC, or to be more contemporary, the division between the so called North and the so called South, and there you also have centers of power and authority which are not centers of power and authority of the nation state. It is actually a collectivity of the nation states which produce new centers of power and authority. If you ponder for a moment, and given the suggestion I have already provided you with, power can be located within a family structure and power can be located in the global civil society. If you imagine this particular continuum, that is a remarkable continuum, family being almost dyadic or a very small group, and global civil society could be the largest conceivable human community so far. There is no particular form in between, and these two where you do not discover role of power, role of domination, and role of authority, and the need for legitimacy. This has been the principal appeal of this lecture, that the understanding of power need not be state centric, but it began that way. We began our lecture that way also, following the natural order of the evolution of political science itself. So, that way we stuck to the requirements of the discipline, but at the same time we considered that the discipline now acknowledges that power is not confined to the modern nation state only, that power can be found in almost all collective existence. That would prove one point, and this must be understood, that there cannot be any powerless society. And if one examines the fate of anarchism, then one realizes why anarchism never succeeded, because anarchism prematurely wants to do away with power. But the point is that if you need power, then we can reform power. We cannot dismiss power altogether. This has been the universal human experience. Counter to the anarchist position, the Marxists came up with another historical possibility, that power would wither away, state would wither away, the community would flourish, everybody would be equal to everybody. But we all know so far it remains only as an utopia and nothing else. If that is true, then we recognize the indispensability of power in all possible forms of collective existence, from what is called the acephalous society, a society without a clearly marked political leader, let us say, to a global community with its own leader. So, we do not lead a life which is without any kind of power. That being so, I move over to the second point today. Then from where power derives? This is an analog to the question whose power we have in mind when you talk about power. And once again, in a classificatory mode, we talk about the possible sources of power. Let me point out this particular specification stands on actually an examination of the history of power, and this is the conclusion or the consensus social scientists have reached regarding what we call the basis of power. To begin, and that is the Hobbesian note. The Hobbesian note is after Thomas Hobbes, a famous English political philosopher. He would say that man's experience of power begins with experience of power which is locked in his own body. I have referred to that. I have also added that if my bodily power is not sufficient for the task, we have so many ways actually to enlarge our bodily power that we do, and where the role of technology comes in. That way, bodily power is a very critical input in any basis of power, and more primitive the system would be, greater would be the reliance on a larger army. We all know that a large army will never fight our next wars. It can be robo, it can be through any kind of ray, it can be through biological warfare, it can be this way or that way, but then power based on body will always continue to be in the focus. Apart from the power lodged in body, the other sources of power actually lie outside of our body. For example, income, wealth, control over vital natural resources. That is in one block, right. But please note that we are still stuck with the idea of a physical source of power. All the four I have listed so far, but it can also be constitution or legitimacy or a particular philosophy which provides the basis of power. It is increasingly established that in order to be in a position of power and authority, it is no longer important to command only the two bases listed earlier. Cultural capital can be as good a source of power. Let us clarify in this context what culture means. It means basically a network of shared beliefs, attitudes and values which are typical of any human collectivity. It has an extended meaning also. By culture we mean aesthetic productions like say fine arts or music or cinema. With the increasing attention paid to popular culture, folklore, myth, fashion, intangible things normally dismissed as objects of the leisure class is now being recognized as a great resource for claiming, enjoying power and authority. Like any capital, cultural capital is not also evenly distributed. Those who enjoy a greater share of cultural capital, they can enjoy power and authority more than those who are deprived of it. We have the literate illiterate divide that would give us some indication how literate persons command little more power and authority than illiterate persons under the normal circumstances. So, power has its basis and the basis actually feed into each other. Any power or authority as it becomes subtle or as it must become subtle because of a strategic choice, increasingly employs more of cultural capital than, say, of brute force, because brute force provokes resistance much more quickly than, let us say, quote unquote, slow poisoning through culture. This is the control over the thought process or the public opinion, or what is called the control over mind, and all modern systems are becoming increasingly expert in producing knowledge through which human beings, people, can actually be made subjects, though formally they are citizens. Listening, as you all have been, you must have noticed that I explained the cognate notion of authority. I talked about forms of authority, because forms of authority help us distinguish between forms of power. I talked about also how there is no collective living hitherto possible which actually dispenses with power in any form. And finally, I talked about power and authority deriving from an interlinked nature of four particular bases of power which differ among them in terms of attributes and properties.